For my 50th birthday, my children gave me a voucher for an educational psychology assessment and said, off you go, mum, you need to be assessed. So then at 50, thanks very much to some brilliant psychologists, identified autistic ADHD myself.
How did you overcome your schooling while you were growing? How was the experience for you?
I think that female presentations are very different from male presentations. So I was the good girl. So I think the resilience was around turning up, not getting into trouble. Did I have my homework in? No, I didn't have I couldn't do my homework, but there was no support back then. So I learned to adapt to being quiet, sitting in the corner, not making waves, and getting out as quickly as I could.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Carlton D'Souza. This is Million Opinions. And in today's episode, I have Louise Dawson, who is an inclusion specialist.
Definitely.
So works with a lot of schools here, and she has a fascinating story of her own. Welcome to Million Opinions, Louise.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
So how did it all start? Why did you get into, or why did you become an inclusion specialist?
Okay, so a lot of people have already heard me talk about my story, so I will do an elevator pitch, a nice, short, condensed version. I was born, I went to school, I didn't have a good time at school, I wasn't very academic, I didn't fit the school system, and I didn't leave with very many qualifications. So then I went into work at 15 and didn't do the university thing. That whole route was not me. Went into work, went into business, started off as an office junior, worked my way up, became a general manager of a shipping company, ended up in Hong Kong. Spent 8 years in Hong Kong in business and industry, got married, had children. Voila, I am delivered of this beautiful little boy who was later on, not at that time, but later on, identified autistic ADHD, dyslexic, dysgraphic, dyscalculic. Then from there, I've had 2 more children. All 3 of them are identified autistic ADHD. So when it was 2003, we went back to the UK and tried to get the support and the help that we needed. Speech and language therapy, OT. I wasn't getting that in Hong Kong in the 90s. Went back to the UK, put them into mainstream school, got them the therapies that they needed, and then decided the best way to help my children was to take a career break and become a teaching assistant, learning support assistant. So I started there, went into a secondary school, and thoroughly enjoyed it. So I then became a teacher. I did my degree at 35, fully qualified teacher and special education needs coordinator, which in this region is the head of inclusion. So by 40, I was doing that. For my 50th birthday, my children gave me a voucher for an educational psychology assessment and said, off you go, mum, you need to be assessed. So then at 50, thanks very much to some brilliant psychologists, identified autistic ADHD myself, which makes a lot of sense. But what's really interesting is, even though this was my specialism and I've worked with thousands of children, and I knew I struggled, and I knew that when I walked into a classroom, I knew why those children were struggling. I just thought it was because of my children and that I had a sixth sense because I understood my kids. But actually now I know, actually I feel those struggles, I feel those challenges. So that was 50. I'm now 55. So then I decided that working for somebody was probably not playing to my strengths, being confined by what other people wanted me to do. So then at 51, I decided to start my own business. Crazy. So now I run my own business, and I've been doing that. I'm in my 4th year now in the UAE. So that's me. My kids are all grown up now. My oldest is 27, my youngest is 21. They have all been through university in varying degrees and are all successful in their own right. So, yeah, crazy times.
How did you overcome your schooling while you were growing? How was the experience for you?
I think that female presentations are very different from male presentations. So I was the good girl. I would not speak. I was quiet. I was in the corner. And I think females are expected to behave like that. So I just knew that I had to do my time. In the 21st century, our children know that they have the options of homeschooling. They know that they have the options of not going to school. In my day and age, that wasn't even talked about. There was no social media. We had no choice but to go to school. So I think the resilience was around turning up, not getting into trouble. Did I have my homework in? No, I didn't have I couldn't do my homework, but there was no support back then. So I learned to adapt to being quiet, sitting in the corner, not making waves, and getting out as quickly as I could.
And then when you started working, did you have challenges there?
Yes and yes. So I don't really think about that part of my life. So that's a really interesting question. So from 20 to 23, I became what in the UK is called a temporary worker. So I signed up to an agency and I had a different job every week because I was doing relief work. So if your secretary went sick but you needed a secretary, I would step in for that week. And I did everything from waiting tables, cleaning ashtrays. I worked for food manufacturers, lawyers, banks, the whole range. Oil and gas was big. I was in Norfolk at the time. Oil and gas was big, so I did a lot of work in the oil and gas industry, geophysical. But I learned an awful lot, and I knew that I enjoyed jumping from one thing to another, but I didn't know why. I just thought I was crazy, because that's, if you're not identified, that's your perception is that you're just crazy. So, so from 20 to 23, I think I did 55 jobs in 3 years under a contract properly. When I found the love of working with young people who were neurodiverse and disabled, and I knew that I had an affinity for that, that's when I became whole. But from 20 to 35, I didn't really have a direction. I was a secretary, I was an office manager, I was a general manager. I could manage. I think one of the thread for me has always been able to manage a lot of tasks at one time. So I could always juggle. So they say that women are big multitaskers. We can do many things and throw many balls in the air and not drop any. But I think that's more of a trait of an ADHD person rather than a woman thing, I think. So, yeah, I think I did struggle. But I think I've always found roles where, like, I'm a leader. I like leading. Even, running my own company. I do my own HR, my own accounts. I do my own marketing, my own social media. And I think that feeds into who I am and what I do. So, but you do struggle when you are constrained into one job and you have one boss saying, do this and do this only. That's when I definitely did struggle, yeah.
You use the word identify. Mm-hmm. So how do we identify a certain condition?
Yeah, so that's a tricky word, but any word that you use around neurodiversity is tricky. And off air, we were talking about the right terminology, the wrong terminology. So I know that in the UK, because they are using the word identify to be, I identify as a tree or I identify as a cat. So people are feeling different about that word in the UK. I use it because the alternative is diagnosis. And I understand that you have to use terms like diagnosis and treatment when you're trying to get medical insurance. But actually, in reality, diagnosis implies sickness, implies treatment, and that implies cure. And we know that you can't cure. We can manage our condition. We can manage our presentations. So I prefer the term identify, because identifying my strengths and identifying my challenges, because I can use my strengths to overcome my challenges. So if I have to write an essay and you give me lined paper and say, write an essay, I can't formulate my ideas in my head before putting pen to paper. So then I cross paragraphs out and then I restructure and then I have to rewrite it again and then I get frustrated and it doesn't happen. But if you put me onto a laptop and I think I'm very, very grateful to Mrs. Pritchard when I was 14 because she taught me to touch type. So touch typing has been my saviour throughout my adult life, being able to use a computer, to use technology, to use a keyboard to express myself. And again, that came really simply to me. I remember the other girls, I think I did my elementary touch typing within 3 months of starting because it just came naturally. I always put that down to being a pianist as well. So, but I don't know, but knowing how to use my hands rather than my mouth gets me into a lot of trouble. But using my hands enabled me to then express myself. And I think I see that a lot with teenagers now. They can express themselves through technology in a way they can't do verbally.
Can you tell us what is dyscalculia and dyslexia and the other terms that, for the ones who don't know, me included?
So within the education system, because that's my strength, we categorize in 4 groups. So, you're going to put me on the spot now. But the 4 groups are cognition and learning. So this is your neurodiversities and your the way that your brain works and able to help you communicate. Communication, which is where autism falls. Under cognition, you've got dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and dyspraxia. I'll come back to them. Under communication, you've got that ADHD, the speech and language. Then you've got physical and sensory and medical, which is your wheelchair users, people with a hearing impairment or a vision impairment, medical conditions such as epilepsy and diabetes, for example. And then the 4th one is social, emotional, and mental health. So this is where your depressions come in and your psychosis and your schizophrenia and conditions like that. So those are the 4 overarching. And then within those 4 overarching, you've got your separate identifications. So you've got your dyslexia, which is dys means you struggle with, or it's a deficit. It's a negative word, dys. But dyslexia is around words and letters. It's very simplified. It's much more complex than that. Dysgraphia is handwriting. So graphic, if you think of graphic. Dyscalculia is numbers. And then praxia is to coordinate and to move. So those are children who might struggle with catching or kicking or clapping at those conditions. Autism and ADHD overlap a lot, but most people with autism and ADHD would also have those co-occurring. They're very difficult to pull apart. Now, I'm not an educational psychologist or a neurologist, or I'm not a doctor and don't profess to be a doctor. And when I'm working with children, what I'm doing is looking at what are they struggling with. We talked a little bit about how we present in the classroom. So when I'm looking at a child, and actually I'm going to just diversify a little bit, go off the track a little bit about labels. So all of those are labels, and people are really worried about labeling their child. But if I look at children who are not identified formally, we use words like lazy, unintelligent, stupid, badly behaved, naughty. And I would rather that if the children are going to have a label, rather than those negative labels which place the blame on the child, that we have a positive label, which means we can identify how to help them, how to support them, and how to make them be the best that they can be. So that's the labeling issue. So when I'm looking at a child, I'm saying, right, you can write really well, brilliant, but your vocabulary is struggling, so let's work on your vocabulary. You might be struggling with speech and language, so let's put in some speech and language support. So looking at that specific child, what does that child need, identifying what they struggle with and what they are successful with, and use that to build the support program for them. And that's why teaching is so hard, because one person with autism is one person with autism, and everybody's autism is different, and we all present in so many different ways. There's 4 of us who are known to be autistic in my family, but all of us are very, very, very different. My daughter is very literate. She is very... she's into writing. She can write beautiful essays and be very, very descriptive, very, very different to my literacy. My son is really creative and really good at things like graphic design and media and film. Brilliant mind. My other son is into artificial intelligence and can code and can use all of... So what I've always found interesting is he can code, and anybody that knows anything about coding, you've got to use the right full stop, the right comma, the right bracket, everything has to be perfect, otherwise the code doesn't work. He can do that, and yet would struggle to write my name. So I just think it's just a really different way of thinking. And when you embrace that, phenomenal things happen. My children became most successful the moment I said, I'm going to stop trying to fix you. I'm going to try and support you. And when we did the support rather than the fixing, it changed everything, including their self-esteem and their confidence and their awareness that they are brilliant people.
So you did not have support when you were in your school, but what about your children? Did they have sufficient support? I'm not meaning your support, but from the teachers and... Yeah.
Partly yes, partly no. Did we put in speech and language? Yes. Did we put in OT? Yes. Did they have learning support when they were younger? Some did, some didn't. The 3 children are very, very different. We've used LSAs. I've paid for LSA support. I've been through that whole financial crunch. Some teachers were incredible. Some of the, I know that so I have a situation in year 8 for my oldest son. And in year 8 at parents' evening, I went to the computer science teacher and had this glowing report about how brilliant he was. He was running a lunch club. He was teaching the year 7s. He was, leading and helping and developing computer science. And we are talking about the really, early 2000s, before artificial intelligence even became a thing in mainstream. And he was brilliant. And then I went to the next table, which was English, and his English teacher looked at me and him and said, we don't know why you bother bringing him to school. He's never going to be anything. Because he couldn't read. He can read. He can write. He's just not proficient at it. So she said, I don't know why you bother bringing him to school. And that was absolutely crushing. That's the moment we decided to leave the UK and come out here. So I think that's the struggle with secondary school. They have 14 teachers. Half of them are going to be brilliant and understand and supportive, and the other half are not. And that's not the teacher's fault. They come from different backgrounds. They come from different experiences. They come to the table with different levels of knowledge, and they do the best that they can do. But we can all do better. I've been doing this. Well, my children are 27, so I know I've known and worked with this for 27 years. I've been in schools for about 20 years. But every day I learn something new. I've listened to 2 podcasts today and learned something new in both of them. So fascinating. We just need to keep growing. We just need to keep learning. Some are brilliant, some are not.
Well, your journey is fascinating as well, because you've done your courses, and I'm going to ask you what kind of courses that you have done. You said your business is it's 4 years since you started your business. You are an inclusion specialist. So what is it that you do with a lot of schools here? Thank
you for using the word specialist, because I am not an expert. And it depends on who's in the room as to whether you're an expert or not. And I know that in many areas of my knowledge, I could know more. And I know that there are many people who know more on specific parts of that. So thank you. Thank you. So the business has 3 parts to it. The first part is school improvement. So this is training. And the training is for students and for learning support assistants, parents, teachers, leadership, how to run an inclusive school. I'm doing a little bit of work with the government and helping to define strategy. So that's, if you like, the main business. That's where the money comes from. Then the second arm is we have a centre. I have a centre in Arsham where I help children that are struggling. So we will work with... where we've got gaps in the UAE, and there are gaps in every country in every part of the world, but where we have gaps, I'm trying to find people that can fill them. So we work with families to find school places when they struggle. We help families to find learning support assistants when they have specialisms. We help children who are, say, they are struggling with the literacy or the numeracy and they might be rejecting school. So we're helping them to get back into learning, because it's the learning that's important, not the attending school. We work with children who are homeschooled, school rejectors. I've got a few children that we're working with who haven't been able to return to school since COVID. And those children are coming to us because they need qualifications. So they've had their moments, they've rejected school, they've got to 17, they've got no qualifications, they can't go to university. So we're helping them to get those qualifications, to get them back on the ladder in a safe environment. So our environment is trauma informed, which means we have things like cushions and sofas and bean bags on the floor and curtains. It's all really softened to help children to we pride ourselves that it's a little bit like a home. And then our trainers who work with the children are very carefully hand selected. They have to be really kind. They have to know a variety of techniques to engage the children. I used to work with a lady called Bronwyn, and she's the head of inclusion in a school here, and she taught me how to support dyslexic students without using a pen. And that was the phenomenon. Like, what do you mean? You can't teach children to spell without a pen or a pencil? And she said, no, her room as a specialist, hello Bronwyn, her room as a specialist was no pen or pencil. And they would learn through many multimedia resources like sand or shaving foam. Those were the common ones. But she had loads of cards and different ways to learn to spell without an implement such as a pen or a pencil. And the way that, so all the way through my career have been phenomenal people who have shared with me their insights, which has enabled me to learn, which then enables me to teach teachers, but also then to work with children really well. So that's the second part. The third part of the business is bringing awareness of resources that schools can use to support children's learning. So different types of software, different pieces of equipment, sensory rooms. And so we have companies across the world who will supply to our schools, but our schools don't always know. We have a diversity of staff. We have staff from all over the world. They don't know what America sells. They don't know what you can get from the UK or from Qatar or from Singapore. So I also, on my website, the website promotes products that are available to the Middle East, which are affordable, can be implemented in school or at the home in order to support the children in a different way as opposed to traditional textbook. So school improvement, children support, family support, and products and marketing of software and product placement. We have partners.
Well, I'm glad you brought out affordability. Now, countries such as UAE, there are people from so many countries, and affordability means different to different people. Mm-hmm. How was it for you as a parent to support your children when you have to hire LSAs and speech therapists and occupational therapists and all these things, because it isn't cheap at all?
No, it isn't cheap. I think when I'm faced with a family who are struggling financially to manage all of these accommodations, the thing to remember is life is a journey, not a destination. So if you can afford one therapy right now, do the therapy that is most needed. And that might be speech and language, because once a child can communicate, you have a lot more success. So definitely would recommend speech and language therapy as a first for a child with a communication barrier. I wouldn't recommend speech and language therapy if it was a physical disability. So find the child's highest need and support that first, because that is usually the barrier to the other needs. If you can afford speech and language and OT, great, do that. But if you can't afford it, do the thing that you can afford. So often families will want to do and be advised to do speech and language OT and have an LSA. Remembering that an LSA is trying to get the child usually to conform in a mainstream classroom. You don't have to put your child into a mainstream classroom, okay? So the LSA typical job, one is to promote independence. They're trying to get that child to work as independently as possible, but that takes time. Then their job is to differentiate the work to make sure they are accessing the work so that there is some learning going on. But typically an LSA is in there to manage the behaviours, because a teacher can't manage the behaviours of 30 children sufficiently and effectively and kindly across all of the children. Classrooms in Dubai are a phenomenon amongst themselves. Say you have 25 children, typically they may be from 25 countries. You've got children who don't speak English. You've got gifted and talented or advanced learners in the classroom. You've got children who are bereaved because they've lost parents or pets. You've got children who've just moved to the country and so are experiencing that, it might be low-level trauma, it might be high-level trauma. Every child in that classroom needs something. We're all different. So when you then have a child with a much higher need, you do need that adult to help them. If you can afford an LSA but no therapy, go with it. But get your LSA to be watching YouTube, to be learning themselves. You can teach. I taught myself so many things, like how to use PECs. I taught myself. I used it when I wanted to know more and I had the money. I then went and had the training. But you can learn on the internet. I was listening to one of your podcasts. He said that you've got at least 10 international libraries in your phone. So you can learn and you can find the information. But the costs can be prohibitive. Pick the highest need, the one that will give your child the most success right now, and do that. The rest can take its time. They grow, and I think early intervention is key. If you've got the money and you can afford it, throw as much as you can because, the neuroplasticity of the mind, and you need it. But if you can't afford it, they're still going to be who they are. My son still struggles with many things, even though he's 27. But we can overcome those in society, and he can have the support mechanisms to make him able to not just function, but function brilliantly in the things that he's chosen. Speech and language is going to help, but it doesn't necessarily change all of the time as quickly as we want it to. So if you do speech and language this year and OT next year, actually, it doesn't matter if that's all that you've got. We're in a private system here, private healthcare, we're in private education, so it is expensive, but that is also most of us, not all of us, most of us have the choice of whether or not we want to bring our children up in a private system, unfortunately. And so the private businesses will say, if you need, we will provide you A, B, C, D. I don't go to McDonald's and expect to get a steak because McDonald's don't supply steaks. If I want a steak, I have to go to a steak restaurant. And I think it's the same for children who are really struggling. If the mainstream environment doesn't suit your child, put them in another environment because it's likely that environment has what they need to give them the best success this year. Could change next year. It changes. Children change, right?
You do, yes. Your thoughts on inclusivity? Because you said an LSA would support the child to adjust to or be a part of the mainstream schooling. Mm-hmm. What about the rest? Do they do their bit?
Everyone is doing the very best that they can do. Mm-hmm. Whether you're a teacher or a head of inclusion or a parent or a child, everyone is doing so that the whole judgment is not my ball game at all. I will never think, that parent's not doing a good job or that teacher's not doing a good job. They are doing, Maya Angelou said that you do what you know. When you know better, you do better. So no judgment. Is everybody doing everything that they can? Probably for now, but when they know better, they'll do better. So we've got a long way to go. But I think the biggest challenge we've got in society is the ableism. They're wanting everybody to be able to do the same things. And we're of a generation, generally parents are of a generation where you just sat that exam because the exam was what you sat. No, there's no thinking around, do we need to sit an exam? I was delivering some training this morning, and if we think about the UK system, exams at 16, exams at 18. This might get me into trouble. Until the child gets to 16, do they need to be able to read and write and regurgitate in an hour the information for that topic? And my thinking would probably be no. If the child has sat in my class and completed the topic and can tell me confidently about the topic, so as an ex-science teacher, we're doing photosynthesis. If they can tell me what the word means, the vocabulary in that topic, what is the process, how is the gas exchange, what elements of the plant, if they can tell me all of that through a podcast, through a video, through a PowerPoint, if they can bring that knowledge out, then I've done my job. The ability to then formulate that into an exam paper, probably doesn't need to take place till they're 15 or 16. And by the time they're 15 or 16, they have cognitively matured enough to say, right, now I need to perform. And I see this an awful lot with autistic ADHD children. Their year 10 mocks, they won't do very well. The year 11 mocks, they won't do very well. But then you come to the real exams, the dopamine hits in, the brain switches on, and they often get more successful exam results than they do in their mocks. And I've seen it year and year and year. And we kind of need to bottle that and remember that if they're learning, if they're engaged, if they're having fun, if they're attending school, if they're attending their lessons, and if the information is going in, by the time they get to 15, 16, 17, 18, it will come out because they've grown up enough, matured enough for that to happen. The mistake is giving up on kids.
Louise, help me understand how the assessment of children getting into schools work, and what do you think would be a right way to assess them?
Okay, from an admissions point
yes,
of
from
view?
admissions point of view.
No
Yes.
problem at all. So majority of schools in the UAE, they assess using a computerized test called a GL Cat4, and it stands for Cognitive Ability Test. And it's an ability test, which means it's not what could your children, what knowledge do your children have? It's how do you think and process information. There's 4 batteries, and I'm simplifying this massively. So the first battery is verbal, and it's how you process language rather than how you speak. It implies speech, but it's not. It's how you process words, paragraphs, and sentence structure, etc. The second battery is quantitative, which is number. How do you process number? So one's literacy, one's numeracy. Non-verbal, it's not IQ, but it's like an IQ test, an intelligence sort of level. Again, simplifying massively. And then spatial, which is the way that you view and manipulate shapes and graphs. Again, that's basic. And so the children take that 2-hour test, and that will enable the school to know is their cognitive ability at a level which they can support. If the cognitive ability is really low, they know that child is going to struggle in a mainstream school. And if that child's cognitive ability is high, they know that they're going to need extra support for being an advanced learner. I struggle with it in one way, because I know a family that has been to 5 schools in the past 2 weeks. They've done that assessment 5 times in the last 2 weeks, and the scores have just gone down and gone down and gone down. So it looks like they have cognitive impairment when they don't, because the first set of results were good, but the school won't take that necessarily. So that's a challenge, because it's one point in time, which is difficult. So they would then look at school reports from their previous school, and they will usually, if they're primary, they may do an assessment of literacy or assessment of math. In the early years, they are looking for children to be able to use the toilet. They are using, they want some kind of interaction with the child. So will they play with me with Lego? Will they let me have something? Will they share something? So the assessment is different at different ages as they go into school. But the Cat4 is quite heavily relied on alongside previous reports. Now, if they see that there's a potential challenge, they know their school. They know how many children are in a class. They know how many children are struggling. They know how many children with special needs they've got in their school, second language, gifted and talented, and they know what staffing they've got to meet that need. So they will either automatically say yes, automatically say no if the needs are really low, or the needs are really high. Yeah, and it's a challenge. It is a challenge. It's a big challenge in the city at the moment. We're really well known for our inclusion. We have some of the world's best inclusion people in the city, in the world. We have, when I look at the qualifications of some of the heads of inclusion in this city, their skills, their diversity, their background, they are phenomenal. But they only have so many hours in the day where they have to liaise with parents, liaise with, every single child that has support has to be managed by the head of inclusion. That's their legal responsibility. I know one head of inclusion is looking after 400 children. Wow. How do you meet with 400 parents And is it fair to then put another family in there when they know they can't get that support? So I struggle with it. I do struggle with it because I feel the pain. I know the pain. I'm dealing with it on a day-to-day basis. But honestly, if a school says no, they're not doing it because of the child. They're doing it because they're already at capacity. And so many of our schools are absolutely full at capacity. I've been a head of inclusion where I have taken too many children, and it has always backfired on me. And you can try and be kind, but actually sometimes kindness isn't the right thing to do. And it can be really hard. So I've done that role. I've made that mistake.
How do the parents cope?
It's quite traumatic because it's very personal. Your child is the one thing, you made it, right? You made it. And if they are struggling, it's very, very personal. And I think when I look back to when my child was struggling the most and how emotionally dysregulated I became. So he's got another detention. Why has he got another detention? You're being mean. He still can't spell. Well, you're his teachers. Why can't you teach him to spell? He's not communicating with us. Well, teach him to communicate. I'm his mum. I'm going to feed him and clothe him and wash him and make sure he sleeps. It's your job to teach him. And I think I became very defensive because I didn't understand. And so when I see parents experiencing that emotional dysregulation, on one hand, I get it. Totally get it. It's hard. You do grow out of it because unfortunately children grow up. They don't stay the same age day on day. So they grow, their needs change, and so they grow. So therefore you have to grow. And then you've got parents who are crazy like me who decide, I need to understand why my child's doing that. I need to understand the system. I need to understand. And when I understood, and now I find one of my strengths is explaining to parents that journey. How do you react when you've been refused entry to 58 schools? But I would never have applied to 58. If 5 schools had said no to me, I'd be providing them something different and trying to work out how do I get them to the point where they're learning, even if that's not in school. So traumatic is how parents deal with it.